It's Shane Kanto, your Wasteland Reviewer, and welcome to the Wasteland, my weekly show where I take a deep dive into a particular film. And we made it to the 1930s here, and they're talkies-ish for some of these movies with John Ford, but we're going to be talking about Born Reckless. Who am I going to be talking about it with? My buddy Rowan. Rowan, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. I mean, you know that I was born reckless myself, so this seemed like the perfect one for me.
Yes, Rowan was born for this. You're all welcome for that. Enjoy. But for those who have not tuned in to Welcome to the Wasteland before, we have 3 segments. We're going to be doing our coming attractions for October 6th, and what a weekend it is. And then we'll be talking about our feature, Born Reckless, by director John Ford, and we have some recommendations for you. Now, let's get things started with coming attractions. We're going to do our 2 most anticipated ones. Then I'll read off the insane amount of movies that are coming out this weekend. But Rowan, what are you most excited about?
So there's a lot of stuff that's coming out this week that has so far gotten not great reviews. And so there is a limit to what I'm really excited about this week. But the movie I'm most excited about is one that probably not a lot of people have seen yet. But that is called Totally Killer. That comes out on Friday on Amazon Prime. It's sort of like, it is a genre blend, comedy horror, of essentially like horror time travel, which we don't see a lot. We have horror Freaky Friday, we have horror Groundhog Day, but horror time travel is we have The Final Girls. I'd say that movie might be the closest we've gotten so far. But this movie just looks super fun. It has Kiernan Shipka in it, who I really love from everything I've seen her in. Randall Park too, who despite some of the questionable stuff he's in, like I was like him. I always find him pretty funny. And so this movie just looks goofy and fun. And Shane, you said that you saw this today, right?
Yes, I literally watched this a couple hours ago, I guess, at this point. And
does it warrant my excitement?
I think so. I feel like it's like that same kind of like pulpy fun that we got out of like Happy Death Day and stuff like that. It just, well, I guess this is more like Happy Death Day 2, because of the time travel and sci-fi elements. But like, it's one of those kinds of things where it's just really pulpy, pop culture-y kind of fun to it. It has a good sense of humor, and they make a lot of fun jokes about being stuck in the 80s. So it's a fun time, and you should all check it out on Prime Video. The film that I'm most excited about is Dix the Musical, because just the concept of like a Parent Trap with 2 grown men, but it's a musical with Megan Thee Stallion in it, just kind of like, and it's from A24, just makes me think, that just sounds wild enough to work, and I want to see it right now. It's definitely limited release this weekend, and I already checked, it's not playing anywhere near me this weekend, so a little disappointed. But, we'll wait. We'll see it. We'll see it eventually. But it's just one of those crazy kind of films where I'm like, even if it's a bad movie, it at least looks like it's going to be crazy enough to be interesting to watch. Now, as of recording this, the reviews started coming in for The Exorcist Believer, and I'm sad because I loved the first Halloween that David Gordon Green and Danny McBride did. I have a lot of mixed feelings about the 2 follow-ups, but like I'm like, well, at least they'll nail this first one, right? Doesn't sound like it, but we'll have to see for ourselves watching it. But we do have the new Exorcist. We have Foe, which that has Paul Mescal in it, right? And
yes, and it has gotten even worse reviews than The Exorcist, which is crazy to me. Yeah,
interesting.
Yep.
I refrained from, like, I like to watch on YouTube Breakfast All Day. And I refrained from watching their video until I watched the movie first. I'm like, well, I'm sure they didn't like it then, if it's getting that bad of reviews. But there's a whole bunch of stuff coming out, like Cat Person, Joan Baez documentary, crazy, like Locke except Australian and unhinged, stuck in a car movie, all kinds of different stuff. There's a prequel to Pet Cemetery coming out on Paramount Plus. The Paris Hotel, which is Australian film, definitely worth it. A new VHS 85. So many things. There's like 20 releases in some shape or form this weekend. So plenty of things to keep you busy. But sounds like not a ton of them were great. So it's a disappointing.
Yeah.
And then Taylor Swift will show up next weekend to cleanse the theaters just in time for Martin Scorsese to come back the following week. So that's going to be an easy week for me to pick what I'm most excited about. But let's get things started with our feature of the week, which is Born Reckless. This is from 1930. It is a war film and a crime film. Hoping to use the publicity to get reelected, a judge sentences a notorious gangster to fight in the war. That's a synopsis on IMDb, and I feel like that doesn't really describe most of what this movie is, to be honest.
Yeah.
That's a weird plot synopsis that IMDb has there. Like, that's like a part of like the beginning part of the movie. But this is starring Edmund Lowell. It's based off of a novel, Louis Beretti. It is a crime tale, and it's a full talkie for John Ford early in that talkie era. And I'm going to start a new segment on this show called, hey, look, it's Ward Bond, who's one of the big supporting actors in The Searchers. And then both movies, because I watched this and then the next film I'm going to be doing next week, he was in both of them. And I'm like, how many of these John Ford movies will I watch that has Ward Bond in it? So I'm going to keep a tally. It's going to be a fun game for me. But he's like he's the sergeant when they all line up in roll call, and he's like yelling at them and stuff like that. But for this film, Rowan, what are your general thoughts on Born Reckless?
I found it to be, how do I say this nicely? It's boring. I did not have a great time with this movie. I was honestly pretty hooked at the beginning, because John Ford is great at proving that he has what it takes to be a director. Like he clearly knows how to use a camera and how to use it effectively to convey tension or action. Like there's a police chase at the beginning of this movie that's like shot pretty well, especially for the time period. And then it just gets bogged down in like politics and talking. And I had difficulty following what was happening, which is never a good sign. And I just found it to be not super interesting. The characters weren't as engaging for me. It was more legible than the last movie I talked about on the show, which was Cameo Kirby. So at least I could understand on a basic sense what was going on. But that's really all that I appreciated about it. It felt, despite being like 76 minutes, it felt pretty drawn out, which is another not great sign. But like it's a gangster movie, and it feels like it was trying to pretend to be something else, but I never bought that it was something else. It always felt like a gangster movie to me, with just none of the engaging elements that I usually enjoy in gangster movies. But I guess like I'm approaching that from a modern standpoint, and not as much from like, I mean, I'm sure this movie was pretty, this genre was still mostly unexplored. So to see a relic of that from the past, I think is very interesting.
Yeah, the things that stood out to me most were the technical aspects of the film. Because if you think about it plot-wise, so you have this opening sequence, you get this sentencing, and then it's like, we're going off to war. And it's like, we're going to get some more film aspects. And it's just them just casually being in like French villages and stuff like that and just talking. And I'm like, huh, that's interesting. Like, then there's like a very brief sequence of blowing up houses and stuff like that where I'm like, oh, it's starting to get real. And then they came home. And then I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
How much more of this movie? Like, and then
it's most of it.
and then it turns back into like full-blown gangster movie.
Yeah.
And I just feel like, especially in his early talkies so far, there have been obvious sequences put in there to show off people singing.
Mhm.
Because it's like, hey, we could talk now. So throw in some music a bit.
Why
And like
not?
what I mentioned, like the technical aspects, that opening scene with like the camera behind the truck, like tracking in, and I'm like, oh, it grabbed your attention right away. And that bit a little bit of a shootout. I did feel like there's, because I read this on YouTube, I think, or was on YouTube.
I found it on YouTube for
Yeah,
free. Yeah.
it was pretty bad sound mixing, and I'm assuming that's still like an issue of like early talkies of like, either it's just like we really need to focus on this talking and there's like no other noise and it's
Mhm.
just like awkward and weird. But like I mentioned, there's that big explosion, and then there's a couple of beats towards the end of the film, like there's that little shootout where like the lights go out. I thought that was a cool little sequence. And then there's one last like gun related incident where like the camera pulls back between swinging doors and you just get it like perfectly framed there to be like building tension because you don't know exactly what happened until the doors swing back open again. And I'm like, okay, I can see the technical things that John Ford's doing really well in this
Mhm.
movie. It's just a matter of, I feel like he was just like, hey, Edmund Lowell, go be charismatic or something. And that's basically him going scene to scene, like flirting with French women in the
Yeah.
war, or and then it tries to get more serious towards the end. But like I feel like it just hits a lot of very basic beats that you would expect from a very basic gangster movie. And if it weren't for John Ford, I feel like this movie wouldn't really have much at all going for it, to
Yeah.
be honest.
Definitely. It would kind
But
of just fade into obscurity, I
mhm.
feel like. Yeah.
Well, and I don't really think this is one of like his big famous films. I feel like there's only one film that I've watched so far that I feel like is a truly great film, and that's what Foster and I got to talk about, Four Sons. I thought
Mhm.
that was legitimately a great movie. And then a lot of this is just him showing off and like piecing things together. So
Yeah.
I still have a few more months to get to the end of the 30s, getting into like stagecoach territory and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So, but this is an early talkie. It's trying to mix genres. Didn't mix them very well, but at least some of the technical things stood out to me.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
Rowan, do you have? Yeah.
I feel the same way. It didn't make too much of an impact on me, which is disappointing because you hear John Ford gangster movie and you get kind of excited,
Mhm.
and then it just doesn't really blow you away in the way that you hoped. But I mean, that's okay. He's still sort of figuring out who he is as a director, and so I'm excited to sort of examine more of his like bigger stuff down the road.
Yeah, which is interesting because at this point, I believe he had been directing for 14 years.
Wow.
And
To be fair, those 14
yeah,
years were like really turbulent in terms of like
well, that's the
technology
thing.
innovations and keeping up with
Everybody is
everything.
figuring things out as
Yeah.
filmmakers at that point. And like you have a few like amazing films that came out. And then a lot of it's like, and especially with the turn of the talkie, you could tell they're still figuring out that technology and trying to figure out how to best utilize it. I don't think this is the best example of it. But Rowan, do you have any
Definitely.
final thoughts on Born?
Absolutely none at all. I would only recommend this movie if you're a completionist or like studying film history.
Yep. There's some cool things to look at occasionally. But yeah, it did feel drawn out by the end. And I'm just like, are you getting to the end of this movie? And
Yeah.
then the ending happened. I'm like, that was pretty cool. And then it ends. And then it's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, we got there. Now, for some recommendations to all you wonderful people out there. So, Rowan, what two things would you like to recommend to everybody?
So first of all, I am going to talk about a movie that I saw at the New York Film Festival this past week, and that is All of Us Strangers. which is Andrew Haig's new film starring Andrew Scott and Paul Mescal, that will be getting a wide release, or at least a limited theatrical release in December, probably a wide release in January.
Mhm.
But this is a movie that like I knew that I was going to like, but I wasn't sure to what extent I would like it, and then it just hit me like a ton of bricks near the end and just made me cry multiple times. This movie is like on another level of emotional and making you feel things that you never really knew that you could feel in a way that you could feel. Um, every single person in this movie, Andrew Scott, Paul Mescal, Jamie Bell, and Claire Foy are in it too, are giving, I think, the best performances of their career so far. So I really, really hope that this is an awards contender. But it just, I don't know, all of the performances are fantastic, and it just feels like Andrew Haig really transcended expectations
Mhm.
with just an absolutely beautiful and raw love story that sort of melds fantasy and reality and surrealism in a really interesting way too. This is one you should probably go into it knowing as little as possible. But I would recommend this to like everyone who like, if you love movies, if you see one movie a year or 50 movies or 500 movies a year or 600 movies a year, however much you see, Shane, I would recommend this to everyone. It's very, very special, and I will be thinking about it for a while.
I
But
am
yeah.
looking at this. I heard about this, and just from the
Mhm.
premise alone, I was excited. I'm a fan of Lean on Pete, one of Haig's other films, so I'll definitely be interested to check this out. I do really enjoy Andrew Scott too, and obviously Paul
Yes.
Mescal's having quite a moment, so good for him.
Yeah, quite a week with the fantastically reviewed All of Us Strangers and the terribly reviewed Foe, both premiering in different respects.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, my next recommendation is a movie called Napoleon, which you might be thinking that movie hasn't come out yet, but no, this movie is from almost a century ago. This is 1927, from the French director Abel Gance. This is a 5.5 hour historical epic that only covers like a fifth of Napoleon's life story, because his original plan was to make 5 Napoleon epics, and then he realized he's not going to have enough money for this. But this movie, this originally the first one, is so fantastic. Battles, romance, politics. In terms of silent filmmaking, this is like the peak, especially
Mhm.
from um, the 1920s. This is just a new level of filmmaking. Like, you don't see stuff on this scale or with this competent filmmaking today, let alone back then. It just felt very modern. The camera work is fantastic. Like, blocking ideas I thought were very, very cool. And yes, it's long. I did watch it in many chunks. But it's just so excellent. So, I feel like if you're interested in film history, prioritize this over Born Reckless. It is hard to find, but if you can get a copy somehow, definitely check it out. It's great both as a piece of history and just a great piece of art in general.
Yeah, and you gotta squeeze that in before we get to Napoleon coming out for Thanksgiving.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm
So
so curious as to how, like, if Ridley has seen this. I'm sure he has, and how much he will take from it or borrow.
it'll be very interesting. Now I got a
Yeah.
couple of recommendations. So a new film, The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar. So I am a huge Roald Dahl fan. I'm a huge Wes Anderson fan. And when I found out that he was doing a series of shorts on Netflix, I got very excited. Like I was on Foster level excited because I feel like we're the two that if out of at least all the people I know on Letterboxd probably appreciated them the most. And honestly, this short film literally felt like I was transported back into middle school when I read this
Mhm.
book for the first time.
Yeah.
I really don't want anybody adapting Roald Dahl except for Wes Anderson at this point. I'm just like, I feel like he gets it. And if he keeps having Ray Fiennes playing Roald Dahl and like using that as framing devices for all these, I'm down.
Yeah.
And Benedict Cumberbatch was so great. Ben Kingsley. It made me like hope that Richard Ayoade winds up in more Wes Anderson stuff. Especially after the Rat Catcher, which oddly enough, I have almost, I think, 1,100 views on my review for that in like 3 days. And I'm like, it's blowing up.
Why not? Yeah.
So, but I really didn't. I loved Henry Sugar a lot. And I'm like, this is like the most perfect Roald Dahl adaptation. So that and Fantastic Mr. Fox, obviously, because that was just
Nice.
So this is interesting because we're about to record about this, but one film off of watch list was Best Years of Our Lives. I won't get too much into it because Rowan and I are going to be talking about it, and you should check out Rowan in the Wasteland. But this is just a very emotionally affecting movie about the challenges of soldiers coming back home. And what's really, really frustrating is that this is still the same kind of problem now. And it's just like, wow, we haven't improved since World War II. Good for us, America. Really treating our soldiers right. And I was really impressed by that one actual soldier who lost his hands and who is not an actor in this movie. But we'll get into that when we actually talk about the film. And then one rewatch was The Road Warrior, one of my favorite films. And I'm doing that for the Wasteland Vintage Roadshow with my brother Ethan. So check out for that podcast coming out in the beginning of November. But this is just like, how do you make the perfect action movie with no budget? Just ask George Miller. Yeah. And then how do you make the perfect action movie with $150 million? Just ask George Miller. And that's Fury Road instead. So there you go. But those are all of our recommendations. And that's the wrap on this episode of Welcome to the Wasteland. Rowan, thank you so much for always coming on and being a great pal and collaborator.
Always.
And Rowan will be returning for a future episode, Dr. Bull, coming out my birthday weekend, November 17th. And next week, we'll be jumping into Up the River with Adam from Down Under, starring both Spencer Tracy and Humphrey Bogart, which was an interesting, it was both their first feature film debuts. So that'll be an interesting talk next week. But all of you out there, thank you as always for tuning in and supporting your Wasteland Reviewer.